Hello, everybody, and once again, welcome to the Paradise Express. Today's destination is Memory Lane. A while back, Kayla Griner, our youth minister director, said to me, I think it would be fun if people knew why you're so interested in trains. So today, we're going to take a trip to Memory Lane. So all aboard. And now I'm going to take my little conductor's hat off, and we're going to talk a little bit about Memory Lane. How is it that I became so fascinated with trains? Well, it's in my family history. On my father's side of the family, back in the late 1800s, the 19th century, the railroad, the Milwaukee Road at the time, was expanding westward through the northern part of the state of Iowa, and it was passing through Fort Atkinson, my home. And so obviously the railroad company needed laborers to build the track. And so my grandfather and one of his brothers and then a nephew, they all began working for the Milwaukee Road. And my grandfather continued working on the railroad. He was a section laborer. He didn't ride in the engine, didn't ride in the caboose. He was one of those people that made sure that people, when they rode the train, had a safe ride, maintained the railroad track and the road bed. And Grandpa, sadly, on Christmas night in 1941, there was a rather major snowstorm, and so he got called to work in the neighboring town of Kelmer, and he was cleaning switches. Now, the switches are those devices that will allow the train to travel on another track. And it was, as I said, snowing rather heavily, and unfortunately, the brakeman on the train backed up the passenger train, didn't see Grandpa, and the train hit him, and he was killed. My father at that time had worked on the railroad, also starting at age 16, and then was drafted into World War II, but then when he came out of the service, went back to working on the railroad and spent the next 44 years working as a section laborer and eventually becoming the section foreman, responsible for about 50 miles of track. They kept expanding the amount of, as he always said, they kept expanding the amount of distance that I was responsible for. And while they expanded that, they kept cutting back the employees that he had to work with him. I remember as a child, of course, my father working on the railroad and riding the train. That was a big deal. I remember one time my mother and I, there was this little one-car gas-powered thing. We used to call it the jitney. And so we got on in Fort Atkinson and we rode the 5 miles to Kelmer. That was a big deal. I remember also as a child, this was long before there were some government regulations about the thing. My mother took me out west of town and then dropped me off. Dad was there waiting with what they called the speeder, or the motor car. I used to call it the putt-putt. And it had that one-cylinder engine, so it made a putt-putt sound. And got to ride on the little speeder for about a mile or two to Jackson Junction, the next little town. And then my mother picked me up and took me home. So there's always been this fascination with the trains in the family. When I was in college, I needed a summer job, and my father was able to get me a job working on the railroad for the next 7 summers, up until the summer that I came back as a deacon and started working in parish ministry. I remember my days in Baltimore. I'd come back in the fall, and I was all bronzed, it was tanned, and looked rather buff, if I must say so myself. And people would say, "Oh, did you work out all summer?" I said, "Yeah, I did." "Well, what gym did you go to?" I said, "The railroad gym." He said, "The railroad gym?" I said, "Yeah, the railroad gym." I said, "I operated a power equipment device on the railroad." "Well, what was that?" I said, "A number 2 aim shovel." And they said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "It's called a spade. I shoveled gravel all summer, or I carried track jacks, or I swung a spike maul and drove spikes into the wooden ties." So that was the work that I did on the railroad. Now, I can also say that over the years, sometimes even when I have the collar on, as I have on today, sometimes I'll be someplace and it's usually a man, uh, will be upset about something or other, and language that really isn't fit for anybody to say will come out of that person's mouth. And then somebody will realize that I'm there and they'll go, "Oh, Father, sorry." And I'll say, "Well, yes." I said, "However, I spent 7 summers working on the railroad. There's nothing anybody can say that working around those construction guys that I didn't hear." So those summers were good. It was, it was good physical, hard labor. There were days I didn't think it was so good, especially when it was 90 degrees and humid. But it taught me the value of how hard many people have to work to provide for their families and keep a roof over their family and provide food and the other things necessary for family. And that has served me well in my years of priesthood. Uh, and so, as I said, the fascination with trains began. So one of the hobbies I like to do, just before I came back here to the office today, I had to bring my car back from the car dealership. I got stopped by a train. I never considered that an inconvenience. It's just an opportunity for me to engage in one of my favorite little pastimes of watching trains, and I still count the cars when the train goes by. And I haven't been able to do it too much this spring because of making the move, but sometimes I'll take my lawn chair to my favorite spot and I will spend an hour or so and I'll just read and watch the trains go by. It's a nice hobby to have. Some of you were in my office. You noticed that I had all kinds of little model trains people have given me over the years, and some things that I myself acquired. Did visit a number of years back Promontory Point in Utah, and I have a reproduction of the Golden Spike that united the Eastern and Western railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific in those days. And some of my reading that I do is about railroads, and I've got a number of DVDs about railroads. So if I can't go out and watch the trains, I can at least pop a DVD in the player and I can go traveling that way. So I hope you've enjoyed this little trip down memory lane with me in terms of my life experience of my love for trains. God bless.